Hello everyone! For this month's video, I decided to focus on something that I myself have always struggled with, maybe because I never took the time to actually practice it: backgrounds. I spent the entire month doing studies, exploring different techniques, and learning from the artists that I admire the most. So in this video, I'm gonna take you with me on that month-long journey that is full of mostly frustration, if I'm being honest, and I'm gonna share everything that I learned, so let's get to it. The first drawing that I want to show you is this train interior that is heavily inspired by an artist called Aller Eco. His work is just absolutely incredible, and except for the fact that he's light years ahead of me, I feel like his style is in a way close to mine because he's also using a lot of dark line work and solid colors. This is like a wild oversimplification of his hard work, but let's disregard that because I don't mean it in a rude way. I just chose to do a study of his style because it felt close to what I already know, kind of. The first thing I do is I analyze his art. So what are the elements that stand out to me? We already said line work and solid colors. And another thing is that he often paints these dynamic lighting scenarios with harsh shadows. And his lines are very free, very wobbly, and kind of imperfect. I feel like he's using adjustment layers or blending modes, I don't know which one. But I think he's doing that a lot instead of painting the shadows like manually, you know, or at least in some pieces that I observed back then. So all of those things that we just listed, those will be the rules of the game. I use a really basic hard round brush for my sketch here because I have the tendency to focus on line weight and just line work in general, as you know. So I have to escape that somehow, and I didn't want my lines to be black too because I think that's going to be too harsh, especially with so much lighting going on. So instead I made them brown and I put the layer on multiply, which is going to make them a little bit more colorful, I think. By the way, you can see the photo flashing up on the screen at times because I use it to cheat with the sketch in a way and the position of things. I just want to focus on the color and light here, so I don't want to waste time trying to get the perspective right because it's not difficult. I mean, I know I can do that, so I just want to save myself some time. One thing I struggled with when painting this background was simplification. For example, the window frames are these rigid, hard objects with so many vertical and horizontal lines. I swear, drawing windows is like the bane of my existence. And the same goes for all the detail above the windows on the ceiling of the train. I find it difficult to determine what I need and what I don't. And ultimately, one solution I found is to ask myself, what do I see? And then literally answer in my mind. Like, I see posters on the ceiling, I see this metal rack for the luggage and the metal pipe with the hanging loops that you hold on to, and then I draw based on my answer and not so much based on what I see in the reference. I only use it as a guiding point because I already simplified it with words, and from there I can just vaguely use the reference, but I can rely on this description that I have in my mind to guide me, if that makes sense. Another thing I decided to simplify a lot is what I see through the windows. I thought about a cool landscape, but then I quickly realized that I don't have the skills to do that. So I decided to make them just overexposed and white. Not pure white though, you should always avoid that, but very close to white. I didn't feel the need to draw those cars that we see in the photo and all of that detail. It felt unnecessary and irrelevant. As for the lighting, I decided to use blending modes because, as we said, I feel like he does that too. So I painted the solid colors and then I added a multiply layer on top of that to paint the darkest areas and all of the shadows. And you know how you always see artists use like a desaturated blue or purple on a multiply layer to paint the shadows? Yeah, well, that didn't work here. Instead, I had to use a lot of desaturated greens, varying in lightness and saturation, because this is an interior and we have all these light beams bouncing around inside and hitting every surface and so on. So the shadows will be greenish too. For the soft warm light, I used an overlay layer with a bright orange color and a soft brush. Now, this is very common sense, I guess, but I learned that you shouldn't paint any light in the cast shadow areas. A cast shadow is when an object is throwing a shadow on the floor or on another object. So in this case, I painted this warm, glowy light basically everywhere, like on the windows, on the seat, on the door, but I didn't paint it on the floor in front of the seat because that's where the cast shadow is. And when you think about it, a shadow is basically a lack of light, right? Because the object is obstructing the light of getting further, so no warm light there. For the light on the seats, I used a layer on add blending mode for like those rectangles, and I painted with a pastel yellow color. The edge between light and shadow will be more saturated, and it has to be kind of like a little bit red. This adds a lot of life and believability, and I will talk about it a little bit later again and show you a very easy way to do that. I forgot to mention that for this drawing I used my chunky brush for the painting. I think when you have such big areas of a single solid color, it can get pretty boring. And because this brush has hue variation, it adds some more interest to the whole thing. And I also used my noisy brush a lot and the soft grain as well. I use them mostly for the shadows and light, but otherwise I honestly avoid using soft air brushes to paint objects and form. As a little conclusion, what I don't like about the finished illustration is that it looks too unfinished and like overly simplified maybe. I like the area on the ceiling. The level of detail there is okay, and I love the colors too, but I don't like the seat. I tried adding some texture to it by painting the stripes, but it just looks messy and, I don't know, too simple and too busy at the same time. I just couldn't figure out how to fix that, so I just left it as it is, but I hope that with practice I will learn how to do that. The next study is something completely different. I got inspired by Shmo or Shmoi. I'm not super sure how to pronounce her name, but she posted a reel on Instagram showing how she uses a red underpainting for her backgrounds. This is a technique that comes from traditional art, and I've always really loved how it makes the finished piece look more cohesive and tied together. So I decided to follow her steps and create something in that style too. What I loved in her studies is that they are very rough and painterly and with very bold brush strokes and imperfect shapes, and obviously no line work, so these are the rules in this study. Following her steps, I made a salmon colored underpainting, and using red I sketched out the composition, but I kept it super simple, and I even kept my sketch on top of the underpainting, so it's all on the same layer. For this one, I think I created a version of my Brave ink brush, so it has a little bit of less size pressure and it's more opaque. I always get super caught up in the layers when I do backgrounds, so this time I decided to keep it a little bit simpler. I think I only had like 3 layers, one for the underpainting, one for like the entire landscape, and one for the tree in front, and maybe I had one more layer on top of that for some individual grass pieces or smaller details, but that's about it. One thing I paid attention to here is that the background elements, like the mountains for example, will have very little contrast between light and dark. And as we get closer to the camera, we have stronger contrast. And this is because there is a lot of atmosphere between the camera and those mountains. And because there's so much atmosphere, it absorbs some of the light. So that makes the colors in the distance appear more dull and less saturated. I wanted this painting to look very painterly. So I used this opaque brush that I told you, but I use it in a combination with the smudge tool to blend colors whenever needed and to soften some of the edges. Painting greenery is something that I always struggled with, but what helped me here was squinting my eyes and kind of focusing on the big shapes, like the big chunks of color and shades of green, and then translating those to my drawing and adding small details on top to show more specifically what are those blobs of color, like individual grass pieces that would indicate that this is a grass patch and things like that. Something I had to get used to is that the light and shadow areas of an object could be, and often are actually, completely different colors. For example, with the road, the area that is hit by light is like a very light yellow / orange, almost white color. And you see that the shadows in the reference are cold. So you say to yourself, oh, okay, they look cool, but they're probably just gray. Because you know how colors are relative, and gray in a warm environment could look cool and vice versa. Or for example, it would look red if it's in a green environment because they are opposite on the color wheel and so on. So I was looking at the reference and thinking that the shadows look cool, but they're just gray. Yeah, well, they were blue. Very desaturated, but still blue, not gray. And it's really weird to me to make such a huge jump from a bright yellow to mid-value grayish cyan color. But lesson learned, I guess, that I need to be braver with my color choices. The next drawing I want to show you is actually my big failure. It's this desk that I posted recently. I won't include the painting process here because I already showed you that, but in case you missed my post, I basically created a simple 3D scene of the desk and I set up some lights to help me understand how the shadows would work in daylight. And it turned out fine, I guess, but after I finished that version of the piece, I decided to play around with the 3D a little bit more. I added materials and I changed the lighting completely. I thought it might be cool to try like a night scene with maybe some blue light coming through the window from a hotel sign or something. So we spent like an extra day and a half working on the 3D model, and my goal was to create a really nice render that I can then use as reference to make a study of it and understand the lighting and everything. Yeah, well, that plan would have worked great if I hadn't created 4 different light sources in different colors, and I'm not even counting the 9 light bulbs on the desk, so it ended up being very confusing. I'm actually going to give you a little tour of my Blender scene so you can see what I mean. The main light source is this cool blue spotlight coming through the window, so this is the strongest light source. And I rearranged the window bars a little bit to make sure that the shadows that fall on the wall will make my composition look good. The second light source is again on the window, but this time it's a big soft area light in a gray tone. And I use this one as a fill light so that my shadows won't be too dark. And then I wanted to have something like an open door and light coming through it. So I kept this one very weak because first, it's very saturated, and second, the light coming through the window is already dramatic enough. So I had to be careful not to overdo it. And then of course we have the desk light, the string lights, and the pink laptop display that is also emitting light. And the last thing in the scene is indirect lighting, which is kind of like adding atmosphere. In my case, I made it pale blue, which means that it will just give my shadows a little bit of a bluish tint, but it will be very, very subtle. I'm gonna turn off all of the lights here and then turn them back on one by one so you can see what each one of them is doing and what the scene looks like. I think it might be interesting to show you that. I personally learned a lot by just playing around with this scene. It was great to see how the shadows fall depending on the position of the light source and how dark they would be and so on. And it was also really cool to arrange the lights in a way that guides the eye. For example, I made sure that the left and right sides of my image would be mostly in shadow, and the same goes for the bottom too. I wanted all of the light to be hitting the desk and the wall in front, so this is where the eye should go. When I started painting this, I felt super confused about the shadows because there are different light sources in different colors coming from all directions basically, and it's just all super confusing. So I hate to admit, but eventually I gave up. But looking back at it now, I think what would really help is painting the light sources one by one, just like in the 3D scene. The problem with that though is that Procreate doesn't have adjustment layers, and it's impossible to do that only with blending modes, I think. So I have to kind of just paint it, which is fine. It's more time consuming, but it's okay. But I think isolating one light source at a time would really help me understand what's going on. Anyways, I kind of left that scene here, but that really lowered my morale because I hate admitting defeat. And it was a little bit more difficult to continue with the next studies because I knew that there was already something that I gave up on because it was too hard to do. So to bring myself back up from the depths of shame, I decided to study something a little easier. So it's a very simple scene with not much going on, but I think the lighting was really cool. So I chose this basketball room at sunrise or sunset, I don't know. For this one, I wanted to try out the grid method that Lois shared in one of her last reels. I always hate the Procreate perspective grid. It's super tricky to set up, and then the lines that get closer to the horizon line get almost invisible, which I don't get. So setting up a simple grid like that was like 100 times more helpful. And for this drawing, I wanted to stay away from line work, my safe space. I also had to decide how I wanted to approach this, like paint the light manually, so to speak, or use blending modes. And I ended up doing both, but I think it was a good decision to paint the wall in its local colors. The local colors are like the truest colors of an object when they're not affected by any light at all. So in this case, cream white and like a really light green. And then I added a multiply layer on top of that and painted the shadow in a pale blue color. It took a little bit of tweaking to match the reference, but ultimately it worked fine. However, the same cannot be said for the light patches. I had to just paint these manually, meaning no blending modes. I just tried to match the colors from the reference, and I think it was way easier than using blending modes because I just couldn't figure out which blending mode is going to give me these results. And actually, I don't think it's possible at all, so just painting was the way to go here. And speaking of that, let's discuss color picking for a second. Generally, for me, it's a big no-no, but I think in some cases it can be helpful. But the key is to color pick in order to understand what's going on and to analyze and see the logic behind the color changes. So what I did here was I tried to eyeball the colors and just match the reference. But if something was off and I couldn't figure it out after a few tries, then I would color pick, observe what are the relationships between different colors and how they change, and then I would continue painting. Something that really bothered me with this illustration was how boring it looked because I had all of these big solid shapes and there was not much texture in the image. So what I did was I added some color jitter to my brush so that there's more hue variation in a single brush stroke. I think that really helped a lot. I also used my soft grain brush, which has a little bit of texture, and also the flat marker brush, but I did tweak this one a little bit. I just went to the brush settings and I increased its opacity because I wanted it to be more opaque. And I used this one a lot to paint in this image, and also the smudge tool, I mentioned that already. At some point, everything was looking fine and I didn't know what to paint anymore, but the ceiling looked so weird. Like you couldn't tell what's going on exactly, and it looks too simple and too busy at the same time. So what I did was I put the photo on top of my painting and I would switch back and forth between the two and try to understand what's the difference. I think one of the problems was that I was trying to be very economical with my brush strokes and very minimal, but I didn't have a strong enough understanding of light and shadow yet to be able to pull that off. So more brush strokes, but focusing on getting the values right helped me a lot in this case. And I stopped thinking about the rendering and what it would look like. I just focused on making the values look like the ones in the photo. So I think this is what helped me get out of the situation and kind of fix the ceiling. A little bit earlier in this video, I talked about the edges between light and shadow being red. You can easily do that by painting on a color burn layer with a light orange color around the edges of your light spot. And you can adjust the opacity of the layer too. Or you can also try red color on an overlay layer. I think this would work just as well. For this image, I decided in the end to still add some line work, but only in certain areas where I wanted more contrast. For example, on the, I don't know, that whiteboard where the hoop is, I don't know what that's called, but the corner is hit by light. So I added some brown line work there, and also on the wall on the left side of the image. It was a little bit challenging painting that wall because once again, I was trying to simplify my brush strokes a lot and be very minimal, but I'm just not ready for that step. So eventually I started painting with small brush strokes, but just trying to capture what I see in the photo, and it ended up working a lot better. I kind of like how this illustration turned out in the end. As simple as it is, it wasn't easy to paint actually. But I think switching between my drawing and the reference really helped to show me my mistakes, and also turning both of them black and white helped to make sure that my values are correct and I don't get too distracted by color all the time. My inspiration for the last background is an artist called Kay Kang, if that's the correct pronunciation, which I hope it is. Her art is very stylized and bold, and I love that sometimes she uses line work, but sometimes she doesn't, and she doesn't rely on it too much. And also I love how she uses a lot of opaque colors and textures. I've said that before, but I think when doing any kind of drawing or study, it's very important to be clear with your intentions. So here my goal was to study color and light and maybe a little bit of rendering, but not too much. So I just shamelessly drew over the photo to save some time because I didn't want to really focus on the sketch or perspective and all of that. I mean, I did that with the previous drawings too, so it's the same process. For this study, I could use the selection tool because I have a lot of rectangles and geometric shapes, but I learned with the previous studies that this approach often leads to a very digital looking and rigid illustration simply because I don't have the skills yet and I don't know how to add a more organic feel to it. I think using the selection tool is like a more stylized approach, and I'm just not ready for that. So I decided against that and I just painted the windows by hand. This also made me focus on values and color more and less on the stylization, obviously. In some cases, I did use perfectly straight lines though, because it can be helpful. For example, those lines across the entire building, like the small edges, for those I would draw a line and just hold my pencil on the screen to straighten it out. I think having straight lines here and there can balance things out, and it does look good. One thing I should have done differently is use a multiply layer for the big cast shadow on the left wall instead of choosing the colors myself and just painting them. Sometimes multiply layers can be very helpful because you can have a cleaner shadow shape, and if you need to change the local color of the object later on or the value, it's much easier to do that. I wasn't smart enough to do that with the left wall here, but I do it with the right one at least. And also a small thing I noticed is that you don't have to use only one color on the multiply layer for the shadows. You can have a lot of variation in your shadow colors and also obviously variation in the values, and you should have that. By the time I was doing this study, I was already so full of frustration because nothing was turning out as I wanted it to, and all of my backgrounds so far looked kind of unfinished and messy, and I just didn't like them. And I kind of felt like I wasted a whole month in drawing shit illustrations, and this final study was like really the last drop in the cup. But the good thing that came out of this frustration is that I stopped being so precious with every brushstroke. I knew it would turn out kind of ugly. I mean, not exactly ugly, but I knew I wouldn't like it. So I kind of accepted that and stopped caring about trying to make it pretty because I knew that's not gonna happen anyway. So as a result of that, my approach became more practical, so to speak. I wasn't focusing on making a beautiful image, but on getting things right, like values, colors, and so on. And that was way more valuable. Sorry. And for example, in the beginning, I would be way more careful about each brushstroke. But at this point, I was so tired of everything that I just used an opaque brush, and if I needed a gradation somewhere, I would just roughly smudge the colors and then proceed. I was caring less about the rendering, and that was super liberating. Because when you think about it, I didn't start this with the intention of creating beautiful illustrations. My goal was to learn, which I was. And looking back at it now, I think this was the right approach because I was just like, whatever happens, you know? But I think I never would have gotten to this point if I hadn't made all the previous studies and if I wasn't so frustrated because of them. Some things you just can't force, and for me, that's one of them. I need to get to the point where I'm angry and I don't care, and as a result, I start being super messy, but I can't fake that from the beginning. It has to come from somewhere, you know? So that's why you just need to draw and fail. I think one valuable thing that I learned in the process of making these is to break down the images to steps and simple elements. For example, if we take the garage doors on the right wall here, we have the solid local color, then we have some dirt on the top and bottom. We have the texture, which is the horizontal lines, and then we have the cast shadows. So painting things in that or similar order really helps to understand what's going on. Otherwise, you look at it and it's just kind of a mess of 1,000 things happening all at the same time, and it can be very confusing and hard to decipher. Another thing I learned is that just as you would stylize objects and people, you need to stylize light and shadow too. You need to think about their shapes, simplify them, exaggerate them to fit what you're trying to say. It's the same as with characters, really. What really helped me here was having specific reference and a clear intention, as we said. So with each piece, I had a reference photo of the place and also an artist whose style I kind of wanted to imitate. So I would have a couple of their pieces pulled out next to my photo, and having all of those images side by side was like, it really helped me not to be confused about what I'm trying to draw and how. I think a lot of times when we sit down to draw something that we can't, in my case that's backgrounds, a lot of the difficulty comes from the fact that you don't know in what style to draw the thing, and as much as everyone can tell you, style doesn't matter, just keep drawing and over time it will develop. Yes, that's true, but in what style do you draw the thing until you come up with your own, you know? I think no one ever answered that question, and it can leave you feeling a little bit lost and confused. So what I did here was I just chose one artist for each study and have them be like my main pivot point. And I wasn't trying to copy their styles too literally or anything like that, but I simply observed it and noted some general things that stand out to me, and I used those things as a guide. Like with the first artist, for example, dark outlines, solid colors, strong lighting, that's it. Then I just keep those things in mind, and these are kind of like the rules of the drawing. So whenever I feel lost, I just go back to these things to remind me of where I was headed. But what's very important to say here is that you shouldn't take one single artist that you really admire and only study their work and draw in their style in the hopes that eventually you'll develop your own, because that's not gonna happen and you will just look like a cheap ripoff. So doing studies of multiple artists is really important here. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much about style because we're not there yet. I'm really happy that I decided to do that this month, and I'm also very grateful that you guys supported me and showed excitement. I honestly learned so much, and I think it made me realize how stuck I was in drawing the same things over and over again, and how many things I can actually do if I just set my mind to it. It showed me how much more there is to art than just my silly little characters in the same style for years. I just got really excited about practicing lighting and adding shadows, about painting in general. I think that's so cool, and I'm so excited about all the potential that those things hold. I feel like with each one of these studies, my approach for art changed a little, and that gives me so much hope about how I can develop my style further. But I will talk more about that in the podcast episode. This video is already too long, so I think I'm gonna wrap it up here. I really hope it was interesting for you to join me on this journey. I hope you learned things with me, and I want to leave you with one of the most important things that I learned this month. I was super frustrated all month because everything I painted was ugly and at least not how I wanted it to look, okay? I felt like I was wasting my time. I was looking at all of those cool artists and comparing what I was doing to their work and thinking how it's nowhere near close to it. But then I remembered why I started this challenge. It was to learn, and the fact that I didn't like anything I was drawing meant only one thing. I was doing things I can't do, so I am learning. I'm out of my comfort zone, way out of it. And about comparing my work to those artists that I was looking up to, I guess that's very common sense, but I do backgrounds like once a year, and for a lot of those people, that's their job. So when you think about it, it's perfectly normal that mine just won't look the same from the first try. And I realized that I was judging myself a little bit too hard, and it was kind of unfair. I think a lot of times when we judge ourselves like that, it's not really motivating, but it's the opposite of that. It's like constantly having someone behind your shoulder who is watching you draw and yelling at you that you suck and everything you draw is shit. I mean, that can be helpful. So yeah, that's my little conclusion from this video. Be a little bit gentler with yourself. it's a journey to figure out how to not be too soft and how to push yourself, but also not be too harsh. But I think it's important to learn where the middle ground is. I think that's a very valuable skill. Thank you guys so much for allowing me to spend my entire month learning something completely new. As frustrated as I was this whole time, I'm also incredibly grateful and happy that I had the opportunity to learn and expand my skills. That's really, really important to me, so thank you so much, and I will see you soon. Bye bye!